Why India is the nation everyone fears now. When we talk about fear in the global stage, we aren't talking about the kind of fear that comes from weakness, chaos, or instability. No. The kind of fear I'm talking about is respect disguised as fear, caution dressed as diplomacy, and hesitation rooted in the undeniable rise of a power that has been underestimated for far too long. Today, that nation is India. And whether the world likes it or not, whether the West, China, or any other global player admits it or not, India has become the one nation they all fear, not because it seeks war, not because it tries to impose itself on others, but because it has awakened, and once a sleeping giant wakes, earth shakes beneath its feet. For decades, people doubted India. They laughed at the poverty, they mocked the bureaucracy, they dismissed the chaos of its democracy. They thought India would forever be a land of contradictions, a place too divided by language, religion, caste, and culture to ever stand together as a unified global force. But here's the reality unfolding in front of us. India is no longer the nation of stereotypes. It is a nation that has learned how to convert diversity into strength, how to transform chaos into strategy, and how to weaponize resilience into an unstoppable force. That is what terrifies the world, because you can predict a dictatorship, but you can't predict a billion people moving with the same silent determination toward greatness. What makes India feared is not just its military, not just its economy, not just its technology. It's the combination of all these wrapped in a civilizational identity that is thousands of years old. The West is used to new powers rising and falling, empires that last for a few hundred years, economies that crash and rise like waves. But India has been here for millennia. Its civilization is not measured in centuries, but in epochs. Its philosophies shaped Asia long before Europe even discovered the world beyond its borders. That kind of civilizational depth means India doesn't just rise temporarily. It rises in cycles, and every time it rises, it changes the entire game. The world is now facing one of those cycles, and it doesn't know how to deal with it. Think about it. The United States looks at India and realizes this is the only democracy big enough, strong enough, and determined enough to challenge its dominance without becoming a carbon copy of America. China looks at India and sees the only neighbor it can't bully, the only rival that won't bend to its belt and road traps, the only country that has both the population and the willpower to match its ambitions. Pakistan looks at India and feels the constant pressure of a giant that no longer even acknowledges its provocations because India has outgrown the petty games of its smaller neighbor. Russia, Europe, the Middle East, all of them are forced to negotiate with India on terms they never imagined before. That's not fear of invasion, that's fear of irrelevance. That's the kind of fear that keeps leaders awake at night. Now let's talk about the military. For years, people said India had numbers but no bite. But look at the transformation. The Indian armed forces today are not just 1 million men with rifles. They are a high-tech, modernized, battle-tested force equipped with nuclear submarines, aircraft carriers, hypersonic missile projects, space-based defense systems, and an indigenous weapons program that is breaking free from dependency on foreign powers. The world was used to India as a buyer of defense systems. Now, it's becoming a manufacturer and an exporter. Countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, even the Middle East, are looking to buy Indian weapons. That shift alone is terrifying because it signals the birth of a defense ecosystem independent of the West. And once you control your own weapons, you control your own destiny, but the military is only part of the story. Fear also comes from economics. India is not growing by accident. It is growing by design. When the West thought globalization meant outsourcing cheap labor to India, they never imagined India would use that as training, as a stepping stone, to build its own industries. Now, India isn't just a back office for the world. It is a hub of innovation, a center of startups, a factory for advanced manufacturing, a leader in renewable energy, digital payments, and artificial intelligence. It is a market so large that no global corporation can afford to ignore it. That gives India leverage, and leverage is power, and let's not forget about energy independence. For decades, the West used oil as a weapon, controlling who gets it and at what price. But India has flipped the script by diversifying its sources, by investing in solar, nuclear, and wind energy, by striking deals with Russia when everyone else was pressured to cut ties. India showed it doesn't play by other people's rules anymore. That's what scares the West most, because if India can secure its own energy future, then it's not a pawn in their geopolitical chess game. It's a player in its own right, and players rewrite the rules. Fear also comes from unpredictability. The United States and Europe are used to countries being either with them or against them, but India is neither. India doesn't align fully with anyone. It has strategic partnerships with America, deep defense ties with Russia, growing trade with Europe, careful diplomacy with the Middle East, and a cautious but firm stance against China. Nobody can pin India down. That's why when global conflicts happen, all sides run to New Delhi. They know India's voice carries weight. They know India doesn't bluff. They know India has mastered the art of saying no without shouting, and yes without surrendering. That calm, confident unpredictability makes nations nervous because they can't manipulate it, and let's be honest, the cultural influence is part of the fear too. Indian movies, Indian music, Indian yoga, Indian cuisine. Soft power has become another weapon. But this isn't just about Bollywood. This is about a billion, strong diaspora spread across the globe, occupying key positions in technology, medicine, business, and politics. Look at the CEO of the world's top companies, so many are Indian. Look at the political systems in countries like the UK, Canada, the US. You'll find Indian origin leaders shaping policies. That diaspora doesn't just represent culture. It represents influence, and influence is often more powerful than armies. When you have the ability to shape minds, economies, and policies across borders, people fear you in ways they don't even admit. Here's another truth. India doesn't brag the way other nations do. China puts on military parades to show off missiles. The US flexes its navy across the oceans, but India works silently, letting results speak louder than slogans. That silence is terrifying, because silence means you don't know the full extent of the power. Silence means you might be underestimating it. Silence means when the time comes, India will strike not with noise but with precision. That's the kind of fear every strategist understands. The quiet competitor is always the most dangerous one, and if you really want to understand why India is feared now, look at its doctrine of self-reliance. For decades, India was dependent on food aid, on foreign weapons, on imported technology. Not anymore. The slogan of Atmanirbhar Bharat, self-reliant India, is not just politics. It is policy and it is execution. India is building its own semiconductors, its own fighter jets, its own satellites, its own payment systems. It even created its own alternative to SWIFT to bypass dollar dependency. That kind of independence means India cannot be controlled by sanctions, cannot be pressured by cutting supply chains, cannot be isolated by Western economic warfare. That terrifies them because it means India is immune to the tools of control they used on others. Let me put it straight. The fear of India today is not about what India has already achieved, it's about what India is capable of achieving tomorrow. Because everyone can see the trajectory. A young population, the largest in the world, hungry for success, digitally connected, entrepreneurial, ambitious, and proud of their identity. Combine that with a government willing to play hardball, a military that is sharpening its edge, an economy that is diversifying, and a culture that binds people with an ancient civilizational glue, and you have something no one knows how to stop. That inevitability of India's rise is what they fear most. You can stop a country with internal divisions. You can stop a country reliant on your support. But how do you stop a billion people who have decided to claim their place under the sun? That is the question haunting world capitals right now. So when you hear analysts, politicians, and leaders around the world talk about containing India, or partnering with India, or managing India, understand what's really happening. They're not managing anything. They're managing their own fear, because deep down they know the future doesn't belong to the old powers anymore. The future belongs to the new ones, and among them, India stands tallest. And let's end with this truth. Fear is not always a bad thing. When the world fears you because you are reckless, you are a threat. But when the world fears you because you are competent, strong, independent, and unstoppable, that fear is actually respect. India today is feared not because it seeks to dominate, but because it refuses to be dominated. It is feared not because it destroys, but because it builds. It is feared not because it shouts, but because it moves with quiet determination. And that is the most powerful kind of fear of all. The fear of a nation that cannot be broken, cannot be bought, and cannot be ignored. India is feared because it cannot be colonized again economically, militarily, or culturally. It has built immunity to control, and that is the greatest shift modern world has witnessed in centuries, because if you look at history, you'll see how India was once the most sought after jewel for empires, the land of wealth, trade, spices, intellect, and knowledge, but also the land that was colonized, looted, and humiliated for generations. And yet what world miscalculated was this? India absorbed every blow, every chain, every humiliation, and instead of breaking, it hardened its core. It adapted and it learned. So when independence came in 1947, the struggle wasn't just political. It was civilizational. It was about a nation saying never again. Never again would foreign powers dictate India's destiny. Never again would outside ideologies control its people. Never again would its culture be replaced by imported identities. Never again would its military be used as pawns for someone else's empire. And never again would its economy be left at the mercy of foreign corporations or banks. That is why India today terrifies the world. Not because it is aggressive, but because it is resistant. Resistant to manipulation, resistant to dependency, resistant to the tools of control that worked on so many others, because colonization is not always about flags and armies anymore. It is about sanctions, debt traps, media narratives, corporate monopolies, cultural infiltration, and technological dependency. And the reason India is feared is because it has systematically built firewalls against all these modern forms of colonization. Look at the economy. The West used to believe control over financial systems meant control over nations. They built SWIFT to dominate international transactions. They weaponized the dollar to punish countries that refused to bend. They used IMF and World Bank loans to enforce policies in weaker states. But India has carefully ensured that it cannot be strangled in this web by creating its own payment systems, by building an independent digital infrastructure like UPI that rivals anything in Silicon Valley, by trading in local currencies with partners like Russia and Africa, by reducing reliance on dollar settlements. India has signaled that no financial colonization will work on it. Sanctions that crippled nations like Iran or Venezuela cannot cripple India because it has diversified its trade. It has cultivated self-reliance in energy, agriculture, and manufacturing. So when the West looks at India, they see a nation immune to the usual tools of control, and that is why they fear now think militarily. Colonization in the past was always ensured by military superiority, Britain ruled India because it had advanced weapons, cannons, rifles, ships that Indians did not. But that is not the case anymore. Today, India fields one of the largest and most advanced militaries on the planet. Not just in numbers but in capability, nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, hypersonic projects, cyber warfare units, indigenous aircraft, naval dominance in the Indian Ocean, satellite-based surveillance. These are not the signs of a nation waiting to be subjugated. These are the marks of a nation that cannot be conquered, and even more dangerous for its rivals. India is innovating. It is not just importing arms, it is building its own, making its own missiles, its own tanks, its own jets, its own drones, and exporting them. And once a nation achieves military self-reliance, colonization by force becomes impossible, and culturally, perhaps the deepest fear of all, because colonization was not just about taking land or wealth. It was about taking identity, replacing languages, rewriting history, imposing new religions or ideologies, forcing people to see themselves as inferior. That was the psychological colonization that broke many nations forever. But India has fought back in this arena harder than anywhere else. It has reclaimed pride in its civilizational roots, its festivals, its languages, its philosophies, its cultural exports, yoga, Ayurveda, Bollywood, cuisine, literature. These are not just soft power tools, they are shields. They are the markers of a civilization that refuses to be erased, and when 1 billion people are proud of who they are, they cannot be culturally enslaved. That terrifies nations that built entire empires on cultural colonization. Because it simply doesn't work anymore with India. The immunity India has built is not accidental. It is strategic. Look at how India plays diplomacy. It doesn't fully align with any bloc. Not West, not Russia, not China, not the Middle East. Instead, it keeps relationships flexible, transactional, and national, interest-driven. That is why no one can corner it, because for every pressure point, there is a counterweight. The US threatens sanctions. India buys oil from Russia anyway. China flexes its economy. India builds alternative supply chains. Europe pressures on climate. India doubles down on renewables but refuses to slow development. Every move is calibrated to maintain immunity from external coercion. And that is why they fear. India has understood one truth that changes everything. Modern colonization doesn't come with soldiers. It comes with dependency. Dependency on technology, dependency on supply chains, dependency on imported culture, dependency on foreign media narratives, dependency on external validation, and India has systematically reduced every one of those dependencies. It builds its own satellites, its own navigation system Navic, instead of only GPS, its own space program instead of relying on NASA, its own pharma industry instead of depending on Western patents, its own digital backbone instead of relying entirely on American corporations. Even its social media and digital sovereignty are being fortified, because colonization through data is just as dangerous as colonization through armies. And India knows it. This is why you see the nervousness in global capitals, because the usual levers of control do not work. If you want to punish India economically, you need its market too much. If you want to isolate it diplomatically, it has partners everywhere. If you want to dominate it militarily, it has nuclear parity. If you want to infiltrate it culturally, it has a 5,000-year-old civilizational identity that cannot be uprooted. This combination makes India immune in a way few nations in history have ever been. And immunity is the ultimate power, because it means you are untouchable. But what makes this even more threatening to others is that India is not selfishly holding this immunity. It is beginning to export the idea. Other nations in Asia, Africa, Latin America are watching and learning from India's model: self-reliance, strategic autonomy, cultural pride. And if that spreads, then the old powers lose their grip not just on India but on half the world. That is the nightmare scenario for them, because India is not only immune, it is contagious. Its example inspires others to resist too, and that is why the fear is magnified. It marked the birth of India's assertive military doctrine backed by innovation. But beyond military, it marked the birth of a doctrine of total sovereignty, sovereignty that is not negotiable, sovereignty that cannot be bought, sovereignty that cannot be eroded through subtle means. This is the shield that India has built brick by brick, mistake by mistake, lesson by lesson, from centuries of colonization, and now that it has this shield, it is not just defending itself, it is standing as a mirror to the rest of the world, showing that empires end, domination ends, but civilizations rise again, stronger and untouchable.